So now let's take a look at the potential usefulness of rating scales. But before we do, let's use an example. And you ask them this question in order to better help them. How are you feeling today? It really isn't helpful when a patient responds either, "Oh, I'm doing great," or "Oh, I'm feeling terrible." What's much more effective is the use of rating scales. In other words, a continuum that allows us to rate and evaluate in order to better meet the needs of patients, or in our case, the students that we work with. So a rating scales approach allows a teacher to judge student performance along a continuum rather than as a dichotomy, either as pass-fail, good, bad. Instead, it utilizes a scale that could be numerical, for example, on a scale of 1 to 4. It could be descriptive, in other words, using a range of words that reflect the criteria, and many times a combination of the two. This type of approach allows a teacher to indicate the status or quality of what is being rated. For example, here's a sample descriptive rating scale for mathematics. There are 3 categories of skills that this teacher is hoping to help his or her students develop. They include understanding the problem, planning a solution, and getting an answer. You can see numeric values ascribed to each of the performance categories. 2, if there's a complete understanding of the problem. 1, if part of the problem is misunderstood or misinterpreted. And 0, if there's a complete misunderstanding of the problem. As teachers, we can use rating scales to record our observations, and students can use them to self-assess. Teaching students to use descriptive words such as always, usually, sometimes, and never helps them pinpoint specific strengths as well as needs. Whether the teacher is doing the rating or the students are doing the rating, it provides students information for setting goals and for improving performance. It is important to note that in a rating scale, the descriptive word is more important than the related number. That's why the more precise and descriptive the words are for each scale point, the more reliable the tool is. In addition to the need for us to use precise and descriptive wording in our scales, we might consider also the use of quantitative rating scales. For example, here is a learning goal for mathematics. Students will be able to distinguish between situations that can be modeled with linear functions and with exponential functions. It looks as though there are 2 different concepts that need to be understood. So we could develop a rating scale for each part. Let's take a look at the one that's been developed for linear functions. You can see that it is quantitative. In other words, the ratings are based on a numeric proficiency in the skill. A rating of 5 represents that students correctly distinguish between situations that can be modeled with linear functions 90% to 100% of the problems that they attempt. A slightly lower level on the rating scale is based on a student who can do the same skill with 70 to 89% accuracy, and so on and so on. Now, whether we're talking about descriptive scales or quantitative scales, when they are used for self-assessment purposes, success criteria, rubrics, and other tools need to be worded in ways that are accessible to our students. For example, let's say that these are the categories of skills we want our students to develop: understanding, strategies, reasoning, procedures, as well as communication. For a student to self-assess, they need to understand what each part of the scale means. For example, I did not understand the problem. Therefore, I consider myself a novice. Or, I understood parts of the problem. I got started, but I couldn't finish. I'm getting to the apprentice level. Or even all the way up to the level of expert. I got it. I did it in new ways and showed how it worked. I can even tell you what math concepts are used. By using student-friendly language in our scales, students are able to more accurately self-assess and establish new goals to help themselves improve. Now let's take a look at some other self-evaluation rating scales. Here we have another one that's written in student-friendly language. I can tell the difference between situations that can or cannot be modeled with linear functions 90% of the time. And then for each degree on the scale, you see that the accuracy falls off just a little bit. But do we need 5 levels? Could a scale be just as effective with 3? With 3 meaning, I've got it. I can tell the difference between situations that can and cannot be modeled with linear functions 87 to 100% of the time. A rating of 2 meaning, I need some extra help in practice, and I tend to do it this much of the time. And at a rating of 1, I'm not understanding this well and need some clarification, examples, and practice. Because right now, I can only tell the difference between situations that can and cannot be modeled about 0 to 59% of the time. It begs the question, how many categories should a scale or rubric have? Is a scale or rubric with 5 levels going to be more accurate than one with only 4? Or does having an odd number of categories, such as 5, have an impact on our ability to score students as compared to something that has an even number of categories? When it comes to the question, how many categories should a scale or rubric have, the goal should always be to design or use a simple, precise scoring instrument. Now, some have suggested that teachers should use an even number of levels of performance rubrics and scale ratings, typically something like 4 or 6, because when an odd number of levels are used, there may be a tendency for the middle value to become a catch-all category. So for example, if we took 17 student assignments and evaluated them, we might find that we have a hard time determining whether each performance is poor or strong, and instead place many of them in the middle category, making it more difficult for us and them to know, am I producing quality work or does my work need improvement? That's why it might be wise to use an even-numbered scale. To make a decision whether student work or performance is on the successful side or in need of improvement. In other words, with an even number of levels, evaluators may have to make a more precise judgment about performance when its quality is not at the top or bottom of the scale. But let's say we're an educator just beginning to design rubrics and rating scales. A rule of thumb and suggestion is to utilize a 4-point rating scale and has no middle categories. So what do we do with the information that we gather from scales, rubrics, and from our formative assessments? Each teacher needs to know what, if any, adjustments we will make to instruction in each of the following cases. So let's suppose that we've spent some time teaching and practicing a new skill with students. We ask students to engage in some individual practice, and then we find that with the exception of a few individuals, most of our students demonstrate that they're ready to move on to the next step and/or apply the knowledge and skills they're working on in a more difficult context. Do we adjust our whole class instruction or just find an opportunity to work with these individual students who are not quite ready to move on to the next step? Or what if we find out after doing practice that about 20 to 30% of our students demonstrate they're not yet ready to move on? What adjustments could we make to instruction? We also need to consider cases when about 60% or more of our students demonstrate that they're not yet ready to move on. Do we pause and provide reteaching, clarification, extra examples, and practice? Or do we differentiate instruction in a way that allows those who are struggling to receive extra practice and those who are ready to move on to continue their learning task? That's why it's important to develop not only a rating scale for the learning goal, but also a plan to help better meet the need of individual students. For example, here you see the learning goal that we looked at earlier. We've established a 3-point scale for linear functions, as well as a 3-point scale for being able to work with exponential functions. At each level, we've used descriptive words as well as quantitative information to determine what each level of performance means. But we also need to decide what to do when a student correctly distinguishes between situations that can be modeled most of the time when compared with another student who is only doing it with 70 to 86% proficiency, or another student who at best is able to do it with 69% accuracy. That's why it's so important to determine not only what we would do with the class, but what would individual students need. In this case, when a student is able to do the skill with 70 to 86% proficiency, we might consider some reteaching, clarification, extra practice, examples. But we're more likely to provide more intense intervention for a student who tends to struggle more often with the skill. In this way, we can use a rating scale not only to describe and evaluate student performance, but also to decide how to better meet the need of each of our students.